You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. Quick announcement before we start this episode. We've launched our website and initial line of merch. Go to sonsofpatriarchy.com and pick up a t-shirt, a sticker, or a crew neck fleece, or all three. And wait till you see our design. We went bold. A link to the website is in our show notes, or simply type sonsofpatriarchy.com into your search bar. Now, on with today's conversation. All right, so we got another scholar coming on the series to talk about a movement my guess is many who are listening have never heard of, but they have heard of its Protestant cousin of sorts. And so we want to get into the history, the background of this movement. So if you can introduce yourself, where you work, and some of the books have you written and the topics that you explore.
Well, first, thanks for having me on. I'm grateful to be able to talk about this. You know, most of my work has been in the Catholic area of these thoughts and the point of your series. So hopefully I can add something distinctive. So my name is Kevin Vallier. I'm a professor of philosophy, newly at the University of Toledo. And I work primarily within liberal political thought and its sort of encounter with religious points of view and traditional religious institutions. So a lot of my earliest work, I got my PhD in 2011. My first book was called Liberal Politics and Public Faith, trying to advance a kind of limited government or classical liberal approach to religion and public life that was neither Christian nationalist or what have you, but also not kind of secular liberal. I've done a lot of work on trust and polarization, but my most recent book, All the Kingdoms of the World on Radical Religious Alternatives to Liberalism, came out with Oxford University Press last year. And the purpose of that book was to, as a kind of person who believes the broadly liberal political tradition, not liberalism as a kind of way of life, but more liberalism as a set of principles that how government should be structured in terms of constitutional democracy, the protection of constitutional rights, the rule of law, the free market and social safety nets, ideas that liberals kind of brought together in a kind of broader political philosophy. And I wanted to look at the revival of forms of what I called religious anti-liberalism, which were sort of theologically based doctrines that proposed for kind of wholesale replacement of liberal political order. And I looked across different religions, focused primarily on this doctrine of Catholic integralism that we'll talk about. I didn't get into Christian nationalism because, to be frank, it's a lot more intellectually thin than Catholic integralism, because Catholic integralism has some of the best Catholic theologians in history behind it over the last 1,000 years, really from the 11th century at least down to the 19th century. So there was a huge amount of depth to get into. And then I looked at Sunni Islam and I looked at Chinese Confucianism. So it's interesting. I haven't really worked as much on Christian nationalism, but I've been in that general vicinity for a long time.
Yep. So I'll ask you a broad question, whether you know him or not, or how much you know about him. But since this series is generally focused on Wilson, although broadly focused on a lot of these ideas within political and theological and philosophical thought. Have you heard of Wilson? If so, how did you hear about him? How much do you know about him? Little or much, whatever it may be.
I've heard about him. I never really looked into his work, in part because I wasn't clear how much he differed from the older Christian Reconstructionists, like R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North, whose views I was more familiar with. And you know, I mean, Gary North was extraordinarily prolific.
Yep.
I mean, and Rushdoony too. So I just thought, well, if I wanted to understand, I feel like I understand Wilson's views because I understood those other views. So it just didn't seem to me particularly like I could always read a Catholic or a Hindu nationalist or another Confucian. It just seemed like, or Eastern Orthodox. I mean, so it just always, it never quite, his stuff never quite rose up on my list. I did see a clip of him at the recent NatCon.
Yep.
And I thought he was in a difficult position when Yoram Hazony, who's a Jewish philosopher, was interviewing him. When he said, "Oh, well, look, we should have a Christian nation and so on, and people should have to sort of respect Christianity in public life." And then Hazony asked about Jews, and like, "Oh, no, 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 Jews will be totally respected." And so I don't really know how to square that. I think our kind of bone in the throat of Christian nationalism is you just ask, well, are Jews equal citizens in a Christian nationalist order? If they are equal citizens, it doesn't look so Christian nationalist. If they aren't, Christian nationalism starts to look pretty nasty.
Okay. So again, general question, then we'll get more specific into some of your scholarly work on integralism and some of the books you've written, and especially so polarization in a liberal democracy. So I'm curious, you've already you approached this. You were talking about Christian nationalism as kind of a thinly intellectual movements compared to Catholic integralism and its thousands of years or 1,000 years of deep Catholic thought with prominent Catholic theologians. How, in general, if you're aware or not aware, whatever it may be, how is this new Christian nationalist movement, which seems to get more airtime than integralism, how's it viewed by Catholic scholars in general?
I mean, most Catholic theologians are pretty not universally very opposed to integralism, but they tend to not mind a certain degree of religious establishment. So the idea, for instance, is clear even in the most liberal Catholic documents that while we shouldn't have a state that kind of imposes Catholicism, societies do have a duty to the true religion, and that involves hopefully some degree of recognition of the truth of the Catholic faith. Now, some of them are very left-wing economically, some are more market-friendly, but in general, they seem to think certain soft forms of establishment in principle are okay. And so, I mean, in this country, we consider any form of religious establishment shocking, but these are folks, they're from Quebec or Ireland or Spain or Italy, where there's a lot more establishment, and they just think it's pretty innocuous. So some of your listeners may think, oh, wow, it's Catholic Church so establishmentarian. Well, I mean, traditionally, yes, but this is true of many Protestant denominations. I mean, it's basically all the 13 colonies were Christian established Protestant churches. So, so in that respect, I see American Christian nationalism as sort of like trying to push back in that kind of general direction. But in the Catholic Church, there's not been the kind of hostility to establishment of any kind that you sometimes see in Protestantism. There's really no equivalent to, say, the Baptists, against state establishment. So,
okay, gotcha. So Catholic integralism, that is to be honest, even for me, up until 2 weeks ago, it was a term, even if I had heard, I don't recall ever hearing, nor did I have any idea of the definition or how this is related to religious liberty or religious establishment or political freedom or political establishment, or like you said, a reaction to more progressive liberal ideals, whatever it may be, religious alternatives, like your book states. What is Catholic integralism for somebody who's listening, who's wondering, what on earth is Catholic integralism doing on this show? And we'll describe what we're doing with this, but what is Catholic integralism?
So first, a bit on the relevance before I define it, which I will.
Yeah.
I see the Catholic integralists as having moved first and opening the door for Protestants to explore Christian nationalism more openly.
Yeah.
So they kind of were the first people who kind of struck gold in terms of younger Christians being interested in kind of Christ-focused politics.
Hmm.
And so even though they were small in number, their level of intellectual sophistication was high enough that I think their ideas started to spread, also their social media presence. And so I'm not sure there would be people calling themselves Christian nationalists today, unless there were people calling themselves Catholic integralists 10 years ago.
Hmm.
I think that's just the direction of influence. Because it was the Catholics that struck on this first. Okay, so like that's why listeners should care about this movement.
Yep.
So there are two principles that Christian nationalists, integralists, and I think most Christians can accept about political life, which is that political authority, originates in God, ultimately, even if it passes through the people. And we have sort of two principles, the first of which is that, God establishes the state to promote the common good of the human community, widely held, and that God establishes the church to preach the gospel and to minister to the baptized to promote their ultimate or eternal good.
Yep.
Right. So those are, very, very common beliefs. And of course, the Catholic version has a Catholic notion of the common good in terms of natural law and kind of socially conservative, maybe more economically left-leaning views. And of course, it has a very detailed and specific ecclesiologies in terms of what it thinks the church is.
Yep.
Okay. So Catholic integralism accepts those first two principles in their Catholic form. No big deal there. No problem there. Nothing unusual, nothing foreign. But in the High Middle Ages in particular, the idea of a full church-state separation was just not on their radar. They didn't even see the point of it because everyone was Catholic unless you were in the Byzantine Empire, and then the lines of division weren't as sharp as they are today, anywhere near as sharp. So, and it's also just seemed obvious that if the state is responsible for promoting the good, that the church should guide it because the church understands the eternal good and has authority over it. So the big question, really high and late Middle Ages and really even after the Reformation, was how are these two powers to be integrated? What is their relationship to be one another? Now, we know from scripture and tradition two things. One, God authorizes the state before he creates the church on earth.
Yep.
There's a direct divine authorization of the state. That is, its sovereignty is not derived from the church. And the reverse is also true. The church's authority does not derive from the state in any respect. It derives directly from God. So God has created these two powers to govern human beings. Okay, so we're not in weird territory. So how does the integration work? Well, it can't be that one has direct power over the other. So it can't be an Anglican relationship, for instance. A traditional, say, 16th century variety.
Yep.
And it can't be a pure theocracy either. So the church can't say, oh, well, look, people need to eat to go to mass, so we'll take over agricultural policy. And so a number of people, really, I would say, following in the 11th century, but as those relationships of integration broke down, it's really the 16th and 17th centuries that you start to see a new doctrine emerge, or at least a new articulation of the old doctrine. What was called by many theologians of that time the indirect power of the Pope.
Okay.
So the Pope doesn't have direct power over the state and able to tell it what to do in general. But there are cases in which state policy can bear on spiritual policy, affect it, for instance, in terms of what communications it allows, what education it allows. And the thought was that owing to the church's nobler end of salvation rather than earthly flourishing, it could deputize the state to help advance its spiritual mission.
Yep.
Now, once you get into specifics, it's things like, so the church has its own law, the canon law, and it could say excommunicate people after they're tried and convicted of heresy. The integralist would say, well, look, in many cases, that can be backed up by state power. So, on the one hand, you excommunicate a heretic, and if they don't come around, then you can imprison them or maybe execute them. So in essence, what makes integralism distinct is this third condition, that is the indirect sovereignty, the indirect spiritual sovereignty of this church over the state. It is indirect. This is not theocracy. It's sort of quasi theocracy. But it is an integration of the church's law and the state's law to pursue the sort of whole human good. So that's what Catholic integralism is. That's what it means.
Okay. Gotcha. That makes sense. And maybe so this is, yeah, you said 11th century to about the 16th, 17th century, and there are analogs and reformers too, and how they understood the integration between church and state. I mean, different analogs, the Anabaptist, the Reform, Geneva Reform, the Continental, all that stuff, as well as what you saw at Vatican. So I'm curious too, what are some of were there differences in the way that Catholic integralists viewed the integralism between the church and state, and then how the reformers might have, how the Anabaptists might have within the 16th, 17th centuries?
Well, I mean, the Anabaptists are going to, reject all kinds of coercive authority. Not every kind, but so, they're reacting directly to integralist type arrangements, but also to Protestant confessional state. So their sympathies for pacifism is just going to be a very different outlook. For instance, they may even question whether God has established the state or whether it's a demonic force in some cases. The sort of magisterial reformers, and many times they went back to basically the model that tended to prevail in Eastern Orthodox countries that we call Caesaropapism.
Okay.
In France, which was Catholic, the idea that the king could, say, appoint his own bishops was called Gallicanism. And they didn't make him ahead of the Pope, but it was a little bit more of a state-centered view of church authority. And then in England, it was called Erastianism. And so the doctrine here was that God had made the king the supreme governor, both the earthly life and the supreme governor of the church. Now, the king did not administer the sacraments, but the priesthood was under his authority as supreme governor. And there are figures, and really important and brilliant figures, say like Richard Hooker, was a big influence on Locke, who in turn was a big influence on Jefferson, who said, look, I mean, the Old Testament kings had this ecclesiastical authority. And we should expect that to continue. And that was their argument against the integralists of that day, of their day, which was that the king actually did have some ecclesiastical authority. The integralists are basically trying to laicize kings, deprive them of any sacramental ecclesiastical function. And the Protestants are trying to maintain that in part to reduce the political power of the Catholic Church, and because they have a new and different understanding of what the church is. It's much more common among Protestants to think of the church as a kind of purely voluntary association, in part because of the theology of baptism. In Catholicism, in an integralist regime, being baptized as an infant suffices for one to be under the church's authority and the authority of a church authorized state. So the doctrine of infant baptism, in particular, the details about how it makes one a member of the church, enable a great deal of anti-liberal coercion and religious coercion that actually I think Protestants have a really hard time sustaining. I just don't, for instance, I mean, in Calvinist forms of quote unquote integralism, you have baptism of infants, but you don't have, I mean, like there has to be some kind of like voluntary movement of the will as a near adult or something like that for one to come under the church's authority in those cases. So while once you join the church, it might be pretty authoritarian. If you don't, the doctrine of freedom of conscience here is so strong that I think Christian nationalism is kind of an unstable, philosophically unstable position. I mean, I think integralism is mostly coherent with itself to an extent to which Christian nationalism is not, because Protestant doctrines of baptism and freedom of conscience. So you can say within the Christian community, you can enforce biblical law and, oh, this is a Christian nation. And so but it always has to be that somehow that relationship of entry into the church's polity is more voluntary than in Catholicism.
Okay. So I'm gonna ask this question both because I need more help intellectually. I'm gonna guess many in our audience or many who are listening need more help intellectually understanding because I think when anybody thinks of the state and the church and their integration, my guess is it is a state imposed religion that most people go to as part of what nationalism, or if they even know what integralism is. That's the assumption is if one takes over the other. The state doesn't control the church, but is in some way controlled by the church and imposes church doctrine, church rules, and baptism and political affiliation, all of that stuff. How does that differ again from Catholic integralism and the relation between the papacy and the church? Because it is different. It's papacy and the state, which is different than the Protestant understanding of the church and the state.
Yeah, well, where you don't have the Pope as head of the church, right?
Correct.
So,
Yep.
um, so the important thing about integralism and the reason that many of the American integralists have had a conflicted relationship with national conservatism is that integralism is not a nationalist doctrine.
Okay.
The Pope is an international ruler
Yeah.
of Catholic states in many respects. So, for instance, Adrian Vermeule, the most prominent American integralist, says he's not a nationalist.
Hmm.
Nationalism is a good second best, but he's even, I think, said somewhat tongue in cheek that we should have a hemispheric empire of Our Lady of Guadalupe in North and South America, and free, more or less open immigration in the U.S. for Roman Catholics. So, this is not a nationalist movement,
Okay.
but it sees Christian nationalism as a potentially helpful bulwark in getting to where they want to go.
Uh,
It's also the case that it's not nationalist in the sense that there are conditions under which popes can depose Christian kings.
hmm.
In particular, if the king becomes a convicted heretic. It is part of integralism that the church can release those under him, under the heretical king, from their vows of obedience. This is one reason there was such a fight over a lot of integralism gets articulated when James I starts to force people to swear the English to swear fealty to him over the Pope. And
Yep.
some of the great Counter-Reformation theologians like Francisco Suarez criticize the
Mhm.
allegiance and detail in the process, defend integralism. So it's not nationalist in those two respects. It's international in focus.
Mhm.
And the Pope can depose kings, can
Okay.
depose rule nations.
Okay. Gotcha. That's extremely helpful for understanding the background. So you've covered medieval, um, 11th century, 10th century, up until the 16th, 17th centuries, uh, the integralist doctrine, and then the Reformation counter doctrine in some way, shape, or form, which I think is interesting. I think that's something that's current Christian nationalists don't put into consideration is what you just said, the Reformation's anti anti-integralist doctrine of the nationalist state. Maybe you could talk a little bit more. I think people will build a nationalist doctrine um, from what they view as like a positive doctrine from the reformers, that like they're building this from the ground up versus they were reacting to Catholic integralism and the papacy. If you've researched that, can you talk into that a little bit
Yeah,
too?
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it's important to remember at this time and really until the early 20th century that the Pope had temporal domains of which he was sovereign, the Papal States in Italy, in central Italy. And the various times the Pope would have his own army, his own troops, or at least he could easily raise an army, say through the Holy Roman Emperor, or something like that. The Spanish crown eventually when it's complicated. Part of the time it's part of the Holy Roman Empire. But so the Spanish crown, the French crown, so on could raise armies in many cases. They're also seen as rulers that could have, dramatic impact on people's day-to-day lives, including kings. So for instance, the Pope might not just excommunicate a king, but might impose interdict on the entire nation. An interdict is basically a denial of all but the most important sacraments to the average Christian.
Mhm.
like being able to receive the Eucharist. So it's essentially spiritually starving a people in order to control a king. I mean, I just have to say, as a Christian, it's like supremely unjust and wicked thing to do.
Yeah.
It's just, but these are powers that the new kings want to avoid. Many kings before didn't like it, but the early modern monarchs were powerful enough to tell the Pope to go away. It doesn't mean the Pope couldn't create instability or that they hadn't created instability. So, for instance, like I think one of Henry VIII's most wicked acts was the seizure of the monasteries. So it's not like the Pope was the oppressor or something like that. I mean, in many cases, if the Pope had more authority to rein in these nationalist leaders, it would have been better for the people. So Protestantism is trying to recover what they regard as an earlier relationship between church and state, where the emperor is pretty involved in church life in terms of governing it, in the manner of the early Byzantine emperors. So, for instance, like Constantine or Justinian. So it's not like the Protestants make this up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But they revive it in the West.
Okay.
After centuries of it being opposed, in part based on the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament monarchs. So if you think about the relationship between Moses and Aaron, it's not like Aaron could depose Moses.
No.
Right. I mean, that would be, preposterous.
Yeah, Miriam tries to, but that doesn't go very well.
Yeah, yeah. So right. I mean, as soon as Moses leaves Aaron alone, it's golden calf. So, so I think that's one of the things the reformers are doing, because I don't want to do the Catholic or even Orthodox thing of saying, "Oh, look, Protestants made everything up,"
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's true. But they are trying to revive a model that was much more common in the Eastern Empire than in the Latin Christendom.
Okay. So, I'm trying to build this understanding for our listeners, because most have never heard this. They've heard of Christian nationalist movement. They've heard, or at least been told, that this started in the 16th century with the reformers. Although now what they're hearing is, no, this started much earlier, but the reformers were reacting and then, like you said, revising in some way, shape, or form what this looked like. And
Justinian's trying to arbitrate, resolutions on Christological disagreements.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the idea. I mean, Christian kings have been heavily involved. I mean, the Russian Tsar. I mean, he was saw himself as having the ability to abolish the patriarchate, the Russian patriarchate. So sultans appointed the ecumenical patriarchs in the Orthodox Church. And for a time, even, I mean, many of the major Catholic empires, Austrian, French, and Spanish, could have a veto over popes, papal elections. So it's not. What Protestants are trying to establish is as old as Constantinian Christianity, and in certain forms, as old as the Davidic monarchs.
Okay. That actually brings up a point before I even go to my next question. So, like you just said, if people go before the reformers, they will go to Constantine in the 4th century, when persecution of the church was lifted, and then being a Christian was okay, and then at points enforced, at points not enforced, or enforced correctly or incorrectly, whatever this is. Maybe ask again a broad question.
Well, it gets really established in the 6th century.
That's where I'm going with this. Yeah.
Because with Constantine, there's a lot that isn't clear about.
No,
this is new.
Yeah.
Right. You need it to cook for a little bit, but it's important that all 7 of the first ecumenical councils, including the 4 that all Protestants acknowledge, were called by the Byzantine emperor and not the Pope. Well, actually, the 7th was not called by a Byzantine emperor, but the regent empress Irene. So I guess 6 by Byzantine emperors and 1 by a regent empress. That one was the one on icons. It said icons were fine. Reformers all rejected that because thought it was idolatry.
Yep.
Yeah, the main Trinitarian Christological things are settled by the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon. You get the Chalcedonian Creed, which many Protestants have
Yep.
still say, in addition to the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. Yeah, I mean, the King calling councils. This was something, I mean, after the Irene called the Seventh Ecumenical Council and they said icons were okay, Charlemagne called his own Council of Frankfurt to declare it illegitimate, and still thought he had that power, And this is the late ninth and very, very early 10th century. In fact, there's more machinations even than that. It's kind of interesting story. So again, I'm just trying to establish like this Christian nationalism stuff. I mean, whatever you think about it, it does have historical precedent. The problem is that the fundamental structure and relationships among human persons and institutions is so different than it was in those societies that what Christian nationalism would mean for our lives today would be very different than what it meant before. One big issue is that our societies are staggeringly larger.
True.
Geographically and in terms of population. If you've got a little tiny city state that's oppressive, you could leave. And even if you can't travel very far, and even though people didn't really do that, now that most people are literate, and education is sort of highly prized, the ability to kind of tamp down on disagreements, which just come to humans naturally, is far more limited. It's also the case that we have democracies. And so if the prime minister converts to a religion, no one thinks that they should, right? Like a lot of countries are Christianized because the king converted and then told his soldiers to get baptized. And people just don't work that way anymore. I mean, we could still be sheep here and there, but there's so many layers and complicated institutions. There aren't these more simple legal arrangements. There's too many centers of power, different institutions doing different kinds of things. And that just leads to the fostering of disagreement. I mean, democracy itself says, hey, let's disagree. Let's have a disagreement and try to figure out which way we ought to go. It just invites people to disagree. And so the idea of Christian nationalism today would have to be pretty oppressive because of how many people would disagree. That's one of the reasons I think it's of interest right now, is that it is in its stronger forms proposing things that would have to be pretty coercive, pretty destructive of the dignity of the person. Not to say they weren't back in their time, but you could have a country where everyone thinks this is how we've always done things. This is just who we are, right? And there's some Christian nationalists who say that, but they're plainly aware that there's a very, very large portion of the population that's secular progressive, right? And so you have to sort of think in terms of, say, majority Catholic or majority Protestant countries and how they treated very large Catholic or respective Protestant minorities, which is in many cases either toleration or persecution. And the persecutions usually backfired because there's just too many people and they were too convicted to just go along with it. Sometimes it worked, but it worked best in Spain because Protestants weren't really allowed in the first place. Once you got large Protestant populations, destroying them was just a bloodbath, incredibly destructive. And so I think with the modern day Christian nationalists, if you push them, what would really take to homogenize the population, they're not going to go to where the integralists even go. And the integralists don't even say that you can use religious coercion against the unbaptized. It's only for the baptized.
Interesting.
And so you have to respect the religious liberty of unbaptized Jews and Muslims and so on. Although you don't have to respect their practices if they violate natural laws. You can ban Muslim polygamy, for instance. So, I mean, I just don't think that Christian nationalism is going to be able to stand in a coherent way that it could guide policy beyond whatever the moral majority has proposed, or whatever laws are on the books in the 1950s in some states. It's mostly saber rattling. But there's not what I see any really deep theological attempt to say, okay, here's how we have a Protestant society given the level of pluralism there is in the United States. What do we do to the people that dissent? And I just don't think they have any good account. If they say we tolerate them, then it's not so Christian nationalist.
No, it's not.
If we don't tolerate them, it's not, I think, Christian.
Yeah. Huh.
You have to hurt people. You really
Yep.
have to hurt people. But at the very least, you have to violate freedom of conscience. If you say, oh, we're not going to violate conscience, then again, it's not that Christian nationalist, because non-Christians will be free. But if you don't have toleration, freedom of conscience, then you're violating the scriptures, which is the Christian nationalists take to establish freedom of
True.
conscience. So I just don't think this thing can hold up theologically. I think it's just internally unstable.
Yeah.
And the Catholic doctrine is more interesting because it is harder to show there's an internal incoherence.
Hmm.
But that's my primary critique of it, is I give three internal arguments that by its own lights, it can't work. And that takes me about 100 pages to establish, but I think I could establish the internal incoherence of, Christian nationalism in 10 to 20 pages.
Huh.
It's just much easier, particularly once you focus on the doctrines of freedom of conscience, the theology of baptism. It's just really hard to get it going.
That's interesting. Last few questions. For integralism, which you just said, what struck me, which this seems similar, at least in my uh, very minor understanding of historical theology compared to yours, that Reformed or Protestant nationalist approaches in the 16th century sounds a little closer to me to what you're saying. Integralism views baptized persons versus the modern nationalist, Christian nationalist approach doesn't really make that distinction between baptized persons and non-baptized persons. Everybody's born in the state is essentially under the nationalist regime. So what does integralism look like for baptized and non-baptized, like you said, Jews or Hindus or whatever that looks like? Because
if they're
to me, that
baptized, it
sounds
doesn't
similar to
matter what their
nationalism.
religion is for
Okay.
Catholic integralism
Okay.
or Catholicism.
Yep.
Protestantism is a different story.
Yep.
If you decide, if you're baptized and you leave the church, there is weaker grounds, not no grounds, to force you to stay. And if you're going to ban heresy, then you've got to decide how widely you're going to do it.
Yep.
So one good question for any Christian nationalist is, what happens to Catholics?
Yep. that's what
Reverse
everybody's
question for
been asking them. Yep.
Yeah. So, Christian nationalism, one of its dangers is breaking up the 50s to 80s coalition of Jews, Protestants, and Catholics, theological conservatives, that was able to be politically effective in advancing socially conservative ends. There's a way in which Christian nationalism is just tremendously factionalizing, which is really pointless. So yeah, you've just got to ask, okay, well, how do these folks fare? And if you look at the Al Mohler, Doug Wilson's interview, there's like, oh, they go one direction when asked about things in general, and then go in another direction when they're asked about Jews specifically.
Yep.
And it's just precisely the internal tension that I saw. So they have to care about insiders and outsiders, right? Like they need some way to mark the distinction. And if they're primarily focused on coercing insiders to be better members, then I think that's wrong, but we can have more of a discussion. The difficulty is freedom of conscience. Now, the issue that comes up here is the implicit assumption that a heretic can't be non-culpably confused. Thought is that, well, if someone's a heretic, there has to be something corrupt in their judgment. And in that case, if they're culpable for their heresy, then punishment seems appropriate. All right. At the same time, I mean, yeah, like you could get a lot of oppressive Calvinism, for instance, on the European continent, but you get such an anti-authoritarian form of it in Scotland and England and the United States.
Yep.
That it's just really hard to see why you would even be involved in coercing the baptized unless the heresy were danger to public order itself. Right. And unless the other religion was. But I mean, so in any case, they're Protestant national, they're going to have an insider outsider distinction. And then you look at what they want to do to insiders. Okay. And then you will look at what they do want to do to outsiders. The most coherent position is that you leave outsiders alone and you coerce the insiders. That's a Catholic integralist position.
Yep.
Not
Sounds like it.
entirely, but that
Yep.
it works that way. But for me, I don't think the Christian nationalists have grounds to impose anything that they don't think can be established by natural reason.
Hmm.
The idea of sort of forcing unbaptized Jews to go to church. I mean, I just don't. I'm like 100% sure Doug Wilson would want nothing to do with that,
Yeah.
right? He's not going to box Jews into mass, like, well, not even
No.
mass for him, but like, what's going on in the 17th century.
But
Or
his thing is like no public office for a lot of nationalists. There's no public office, no public function whatsoever. Maybe they have a private life, but there's no public life for those who are outside the church.
yeah, so you'd have a test for office at the federal level, like you did
Yeah.
at the state level for a century or more. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the difficulty then is you've got a democracy. And you've got to ask, okay, if people have equal political rights, what does that mean? Right? Does it mean that anyone can run for office? Well, we already think there's some people who can't run for office, like non-citizens,
Hmm.
or like Nazis. We don't really think they could run. I guess we let them run,
Yeah.
um, but I do think there's going to be a question about how persons can be made in the image of God, and yet some of them have right to shape their political institutions and others do not.
Hmm.
So then if they say, oh, well, look, Jews can vote, I mean, that's fine. They just can't hold high office. No, that starts to look like attention to me,
Hmm.
right? Like you have political freedom because you need to be able to shape your institutions so that they better reflect your interests or protect your interests. But if you want to elect someone from your community that you think is effective at protecting your interests, nope, can't do that. So why? I mean, you ultimately have to say, well, because Christianity is true and Judaism is false.
Yeah.
But if you think that's the basis for coercion, just whether who's correct and who's incorrect, that's going to justify far more coercion than people usually want to use.
Yeah. One of us, so second to last question, and this one has more to do. This is a very broad question, so I'll apologize for how broad this question is going to be, but I think in current discourse, this is important to discuss in general, and even some of the stuff you were saying about Christian nationalist approach to voting or for holding public office or for coercion. There's sort of a movement now to question the very basis of constitutional authority, of democracy, of what this looks like, because I think they're realizing some of the internal inconsistencies. It's like, well, we can't have a democracy and a Christian nationalist theocracy or government or whatever that is. How does and this again, a very broad question. How does Catholic integralism view a constitutional republic, being that it's more of an internationalist scope versus a nationalist scope, and maybe
Well,
democracy in general?
so this is a pretty complicated question. So,
Yeah, I
to some
realize
extent,
that.
the internationalism and the structure of the state's authority are somewhat orthogonal, right? So you could be a monarchist and internationalist, you could be a Democrat or internationalist,
Okay.
or whatever. So just setting aside the internationalist thing, um, a lot of the integralists have played footsie or been openly monarchist.
Okay.
But there's no necessity there at all. So, for instance, both Francisco Suarez and Cardinal Bellarmine, who are the two great integralist minds of the Counter Reformation and the
Yep.
two great minds of integralism, period. Suarez thought the first form of government was democracy. He thought political authority had ultimately to choose a ruler had to come from the people because people were naturally equals. Bellarmine thought that God gave political authority to the people as a whole because God is impartial. And he's not going to give more political power to one person over another person. And I think those commitments push in the direction of democracy. And so, I think you could have a constitutionally limited democracy where, say, the church would be able to direct the legislature to impose certain kinds of enforcement of natural law. And, they could veto, would have to have some kind of blessing from them for prime minister, much like you do with the as a formality with the British monarch.
Yep. Totally. Yep.
Um, because ultimately Christianity's doctrine of equality of persons just, I mean, like you really have to go to divine right of kings. But then I think there's just a whole bunch of problems that actually came up, which is like, okay, so as you have a succession crisis, who is God appointed to win? Okay, well, we've been there and had many European civil wars over succession crises,
Hmm.
especially before a lot of the states consolidated. And so, who has the authority of God? Moreover, what are they authorized to do? And God didn't seem to be very specific about that. And so we don't know who God's appointed or what powers God's given them. And there are ways to try to work through those problems. But if you think persons have equal dignity, then they could start to answer those questions. Oh, who should rule? Oh, who the majority chooses. What are their powers? Well, we put those in the Constitution. Um, I think that Christian doctrine of the dignity of the person and the equality of persons before God really lays the foundations for liberal democracy in a really important way. And it's really hard for Protestants to escape it in particular. Um,
Hmm.
Protestantism is so deeply rooted in the equality of persons.
Yep.
Um, this is why so many of the colonies were democracies,
Hmm.
right? I mean, or at least to some extent democratic. I mean, these folks, if they're talking about monarchy, okay, well, so they would have centralized Massachusetts Bay Colony, like the Massachusetts Bay Colony should have had a king. That's not what they thought their congregational ecclesiology was,
No.
right? So I would be very interested to see, say, maybe Doug Wilson saying, "Yep, the American Calvinist or Presbyterian establishments were wrong. They're
Uh,
deeply misguided, and
He'd
we
have to
understand now that
basically
we
say
need a
that
king."
if, yeah, yeah, you're right. He'd have to say that, or
Yeah,
else, yeah, what else is he gonna prop up?
you just got to hold these people's feet to the fire about their theology, and then I think things are going to fall apart. And again, Catholics have much better grounds with positions like this, like much better.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, Protestantism, I mean, it really does sort of lead in a certain way to a constitutionally limited democracy in a way that it is consistent with its own theological principles. Now, you could still have like, oh, God exists and here are the Ten Commandments or whatever. But like that's pretty anemic. It didn't really seem to do much good. Even the Catholic establishments, I mean, they all died in effect in Western Europe. So it's not clear in any case. This is again why I see Christian nationalism as kind of like fundamentally unserious intellectually. I call it the Walmart integralism. Um,
I like that.
the ones the boutique, right? Not many people buy it, but it's very sophisticated. And the other's bargain basement. Everyone can get on board, but it isn't much. It isn't substantive. It's kind of a knockoff as well. So there are all these interesting early modern, doctrine. There was so much Christian thought, especially in the Calvinist tradition about democracy.
Yep.
I mean, you've got a lot of these kind of center right followers of Abraham Kuyper,
Hmm.
like Jordan Ballard, who were just like, yeah, these guys are theologically completely off base. And if you look at the reviews from a lot of the Reformed of, say, the Stephen Wolfe book,
Yep.
in Defense of Christian Nationalism, they just panned it as being theologically unserious from a Reformed perspective. So this is what I have found to be useful in these, is to have a deeper understanding of the theology and then the political theology, and to see if the political theology fits the rest of the theology. Um, I just Calvinism is just so congregationalist in terms of the rule by elders. And it was one of the very important ways they contrasted themselves with Catholics very early on. That to be a Calvinist monarchist um, requires some explanation, I think.
Okay. So I said this is my second to last. This will actually be my second to last because my last question. Then I'll ask for your final thoughts. And just because I'm curious, because your work has been uh, political theology, political philosophy, and then your latest book, All Kingdoms of the World. I mean, it's Catholic integralism, but then you also talk about Confucian and Islamic anti-liberalisms, and I'm just curious why those are within the same conversation as Catholic integralism because I feel like this is going to have some analogs to modern day Christian nationalism and a lot of the oppression that kind of has to necessarily come about if they quote unquote win their project.
The underlying unity of these doctrines is that they mostly are revived in the late 20th century as a way to oppose sort of hegemony of liberal democratic order. They especially get going as liberal democracy is spreading. Islam's the first here to move.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time you're getting towards the end of the Cold War in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of these doctrines have been sort of dormant or not as influential, and then they just kind of spring back into action. So Hindu nationalism had been around for 80, 90 years, but then it and by the 2000s it was starting to take off.
Yep.
The Chinese Confucian stuff was taken off until Xi started putting it down around 5-6 years ago. Looks like he was going to let a lot of it out. Sunni Islamic, I mean, that's going to be central because, you're looking at organizations like ISIS and you're saying, okay, what is their theology? Like, what are they thinking? That's the most anti-liberal movement that we have seen outside of the Chinese. And so look, what are the theorists of these groups and what are their best theorists, their most sensible theorists saying on their behalf? And they all arise, I think, because first, the 20th century just killed a ton of religious people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first century with globalized, secularizing movements.
Yep.
So they're secularizing in the 19th century, but they weren't everywhere. They really limited to Western Europe. And I think that kind of led people to think the silencing of the great religions, the silencing of their voices, massive martyrdom and oppression in the name of usually socialism of some form, typically Marxism, made us think that we had entered a new, less religious period. And I think we're just seeing a regression to the spiritual mean of the human race, where people will just expect spiritual values to be expressed in politics as they did for thousands upon thousands of years. And so I wanted to look at the global revival of these doctrines, Catholic integralism being one of the least influential. Hindu nationalism, I couldn't quite write on because there's enough doctrines of toleration and democracy in historic Hinduism that it's harder to. Hinduism is maybe the religion where it's kind of hardest to get the really nasty coercive stuff. So I didn't end up writing about it. I could have written on Shia Islam, but it was more centralized than Sunni Islam, so it's a little bit more like integralism. Sunni Islam is very congregationalist in its way. So Confucianism is the most anti-democratic, hands down. It's all meritocracy from top to bottom. So, I wanted to look at the different elements of these new theories, these new sort of treatises coming out on advancing different versions of religious anti-liberalism and to see if they had an underlying thread. And another underlying thread is their opposition, not even so much to democracy, but to sort of the culture of individual rights that they think is produced, and the claim that the liberal state is somehow fairer or more neutral to differing points of view than their religious anti-liberal doctrines would be. So,
yeah, and I'm sure as people are listening to what you're saying and describing these different political ideologies and theological undergirdings, there are quite a few similarities, whether strong or weak, to kind of the modern day project of Christian nationalism, which is interesting. So this is going to lead me to kind of your final thoughts. With how dominant Catholic thought has been for centuries, why isn't integralism kind of more popular than Christian nationalism, at least in the a popular level? Because we've had Catholic presidents that has been kind of well documented. The papacy, the dominance of Catholicism in the United States, and kind of now the rise of Catholic baptisms more recently. Why hasn't integralism kind of filled the American imagination quite like Christian nationalism has?
Well, there are far fewer Catholics.
Okay.
The Catholic Church has had a massive sex scandal of maybe the
True.
worst scandal it's had in centuries.
True.
So it's a great deal of its moral authority is decayed. Most of the major Catholics in public life, in many cases, are progressive, like Biden. And so it doesn't come up on the left. And on the right, most of these folks are following in a big way the Second Vatican Council, which sets anything integralist aside
True.
in its document Dignitatis Humanae in 1965. They're also huge fans of Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And Pope John Paul II they were both pushing for religious freedom at the Second Vatican Council. And they also fought for religious freedom against totalitarianism. Benedict was also an intellectual critic of the confessional state, so the Catholic state, even though he was what we would ordinarily call liberal.
No, not at all. No.
And Francis, of course, I mean, I mentioned briefly, he said in a private audience that integralism was a plague. And since so many of the bishops have been appointed by those three men, and the Catholic Church has 5,600 bishops, not one of them is openly integralist. So those are the reasons it hasn't spread. Also, I mean, just for it to take root in American soil in terms of, liberalism and democracy being so closely rooted, the main potential influence of these focuses among Catholic intellectuals on the right and what kinds of laws and policies they support. So, we'll look at the difference between, say, a Catholic Joe Biden vice president and a Catholic J.D. Vance vice president. J.D. Vance is probably the closest thing to an integralist among congressional GOP. I would describe him as a Catholic post-liberal, but I don't think he's an integralist. He may think, well, maybe it's the right regime in some like very ideal world. But he has headline conferences. He did headline a conference with the integralists with Adrian Vermeule back when he was running for Senate in 2022 at Steubenville. It's called Restoring a Nation. Anyone can look it up. So what the heck's he's not getting money in Steubenville. He's not getting votes. So, I mean, Vance has spent a lot of time with different sort of these new radical factions on the right. So I don't think he's been particularly just doing integralist stuff, but, all the same. So it is something to keep thinking about because I do think, especially if Trump wins, the interest in post-liberalism among Catholics and Protestants will continue because these events do affect whose ideas get on top. So there wouldn't be any mass integralist movement at all if Trump hadn't been elected. I mean, there would have been about 20 people in a Slack chat talking about stuff in a blog. It was Trump that made it possible because many of the integralists decided to get political when Trump was elected, precisely because they thought they could be more successful. So, we'll see. I mean, 2024 is going to be a pivotal year for American liberal democracy. So,
yeah, that's true. So, last thing, any final thoughts? And I think more particularly so, if you can push the inconsistencies you see within the nationalist movement compared to integralist political thought and the unstableness of modern day Christian nationalism and why you think it's just not a serious intellectual project on shifty grounds compared to its forebears, the older Catholic integralism.
Yeah, it's the greater Protestant emphasis on freedom of conscience, on the equal dignity of the person, worries about a very centralized church, leading to worries about a very centralized state, and the theology of baptism not licensing coercion on people that were baptized as infants but never were believers as adults. So it's much, much harder to kind of discipline people that are members of the church. They may never have joined if they knew they were going to be disciplined, right? Baptism does not automatically make one subject to legal penalties within the church. The church directs the state to enforce. With Islam, apostasy is still seen in many countries as a capital crime. You leave Islam, there are many, many, many millions of Muslims in the Arab world that think that's cause for execution. So if you don't have punishment for people who leave, like they just move away or whatever, you think there has to be a strong doctrine of freedom of conscience where people can get things wrong legitimately. You think of Protestantism as something that had to resist certain oppressive Catholic structures.
Yep.
All of these theological features will push against a very seriously coercive Christian state. And that's why I think the Christian nationalists aren't really being very specific in their policy proposals, because there's going to be an immediate question. And the immediate question is, once you get specific, how Christian nationalist is this anyway? Like putting the 10 Commandments in courtrooms, like that's basically nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like in the grand historical scheme of things, it's basically nothing. The question is,
It's been
what are you
done
going to, I
before.
mean,
Yeah.
right. Here's the question for even like Al Mohler, like more mainline folks. Like, if we have a Christian nationalist regime, what about Jews? What about Jews who openly deny the divinity of Christ? What do you want to do? Why would you do these things and not these things? Why or why not? Right. And if they can give you a principled answer to that, I'll be surprised, because they want religious homogeneity, but they don't want to, they want to leave Jews completely alone. And that raises the question of, well, why not leave others completely alone? Like atheists and Muslims. So, those are kind of a grab bag of all the different difficulties. But the key is to look at the distinctiveness of Protestant political thought as it derives from Protestant theologies. And then I think it'll become clear that Christian nationalism's intellectually unstable.
Got it. Well, Dr. Valier, thank you so much for your time, your thought, your effort, your book. I hope people pick that up too in tandem with this series and think deeply about some of these issues.
And when it airs, my paperback version of the book with a new introduction will be
there. You go. Yep. Yeah. If people want, this is why we had him on, an intellectually serious look at these doctrines and political and philosophical, theological undergirdings. I think this is one of those modern books that I think we should be reading and interacting with. And then, like you said, holding Christian nationalists' feet over the fire and says, what do you really think? And how does this accord with our Protestant theology, undergirding theology? So thanks for coming on and helping us out.
Thanks. It was an honor. Thank you.